In this video, we're going to cover some basic components of primary and review articles, as well as how to find specific primary and review articles. And I'm going to touch on some of the basics of the process of publishing a primary or review article. And so if you're watching this for Chem 310 or the Fundamentals of Biochemistry class, take special note on how to locate articles that you're interested in finding, because inevitably you will have to read, I say several, but in reality, a dozen or 2 dozen primary or review articles in order to do well on your own primary research article that you're going to be writing this semester. So here we have it, right? Literature and why you need it. So shown down here are the cover pages of some various research journals. So research journals are where primary research articles and review articles or review research articles are typically published. And so these are probably fairly dated because this is a pretty old picture. But this just gives you a general view of the diversity of journals out there, right? So Nature Cell Biology is one, Pathology, Placenta, Developmental Cell, Developmental Biology, Cold Spring Harbor Protocols is one article that we've actually drafted protocols for our zebrafish labs from. And so again, these are just to show you that there's a lot of different research journals out there, and that helps add to the variety of research journals you might be reading throughout the semester, right? So if you've never gone about the process of finding research articles, maybe take a pause and think about how you've done that in the past. If you have done it, if you haven't done it, we're about to talk about some of those. So 3 very popular places to find research articles are on PubMed, Google or Google Scholar, and then oftentimes on many institutions' library websites, you can also gain access to many research articles. So for this class, we're going to focus our attention on the use of PubMed. So PubMed is actually a website or a web portal that's maintained through the use of your own tax dollars, right? So the NIH or the National Institute of Health help maintain this web portal or website, and it's a excellent resource for many things that you may use in this class or when you go out into your professional careers. So PubMed contains things like genomic sequences, protein sequences, mRNA sequences. There's many things on PubMed besides just primary research articles, and we're actually going to use it for both this semester. So before we get into how to locate papers and how to search for them and find things we're interested in, I'm briefly going to talk about some of the components of how papers get published, right? Why do we publish? Who does it impact? How does it benefit anything? Why do we do it? So we are going to talk a little bit about how the actual peer review process works, right? So we're going to pretend that we've completed a giant research project in our lab, and it's complete, and we're ready to publish it, right? So the first step in all of this is to pick a journal. So typically experienced researchers have a track record and have experience working with editors and reviewers, although reviewers are typically anonymous, in journals. So let's pretend that we're a new scientist, right? We don't have a track record. We don't have a favorite journal. So we're going to start from the beginning. So one component that some authors may choose to use is relying on the impact factor of a journal, right? So each journal is essentially has an impact factor. I won't go into too much detail or describe much more about it, but essentially it's a metric that represents how often research articles that are published in these journals get cited, right? So Science and Nature have impact factors here in the 30s, whereas the Journal of Neuroscience has an impact factor down here around 6.3. For the purposes here, all this really means is that the articles that are published in journals like Science and Nature get cited much more often than the Journal of Neuroscience, right? And again, I won't go much more into that. There's a lot of things that come into play with this. It's just one metric that some authors use. Another component is the mission of a journal, right? So each journal typically has a mission statement, which is their goal, their audience or their purpose, the aim of what they choose to serve. So I have two examples over here. So one journal, the Journal of Pain, their mission statement is to improve the care of patients in pain by providing a forum for clinical researchers, basic scientists, clinicians, and other health professionals to publish original research, right? Whereas Pain, a journal that also specializes in pain research, but note the slight difference in titles, right? The Journal of Pain versus just Pain. Pain is a research journal maintained by the International Association for the Study of Pain, and their mission statement is to bring together scientists, clinicians, healthcare providers, and policymakers to stimulate and support the study of pain and to translate that knowledge into improved pain relief worldwide, right? So those are two different journals that both specialize in publishing research relevant to pain with two slightly different mission statements, right? So those are some nuances that some authors take into consideration when they choose to publish, right? Relevance of journal. So I just described two journals that specialize in pain research. If our research project was focused on pain, we probably wouldn't try to publish that in developmental biology or developmental cell unless our work, was focused on some sort of developmental project that has an outcome in pain, right? It's all, again, that's a slight nuance that comes down to the specifics of the project. And then there's also, the association of the journal. So some journals are associated with professional research societies. So it's just another component. Ultimately, it's all up to the authors to choose where they publish. All right, so who gets to be on a paper? You may think that it's only one person, or you may think that it's everybody involved in a project that gets published. Technically, authorship requirements are set by the journal, right? So each different journal will have its own different set of standards. Some journals allow and encourage technicians. So these are people who are only involved in the wet lab component of the work. Some journals allow those individuals to be on authors, allow those individuals to be authors on papers, whereas other journals don't, right? Some journals set very specific guidelines that you have to have contributed to the development of the experimental plan, as well as done writing and editing, and maybe even some wet work. It all comes down to the journal, and this information is usually readily available on a research journal's home website, right? So it's a bit of information that is out there and accessible. So after you've decided on your authors, you've decided on your journal, one thing that everyone has to follow, including students in the Chem 310 class, is a submission checklist, right? So again, this is another resource made readily available by journals. So this is a checklist of items that need to be included when you publish an article, right? So typically research articles require keywords. So this is 6 to 8 specific words that would help other people locate the work you're publishing. You need to include all figures, including relevant captions, all tables, including titles, description, footnotes, right? You don't want to be putting ambiguous tables or figures into the work you're publishing, because without things to help your audience decipher those, they wouldn't mean anything to anybody that wasn't directly involved in the work. And so these are just, again, here's a list. If you want to pause the video, you can take a look at these. These are just some things some journals require when publishing, right? Specifically relevant to our class and things that I've noticed in the past, manuscripts have to be spell checked and checked for grammar, right? So incorrect spelling or the incorrect use of grammar can lead your audience to potentially misinterpret the information you're trying to share with them. So make sure you're spelling things correctly and make sure you're using proper grammar. All references mentioned in the reference list are cited in the text, so you shouldn't be referencing papers throughout the body of your work and then not including them in your work cited, or vice versa. You don't put a reference in your works cited page that you haven't cited directly in your paper. Permission has been obtained to use copyright material. Our class shouldn't have to worry about that too much, but if you were using specifically or privately owned information like that, you would need to receive permission to do so. Relevant declarations, journal policies, and referee suggestions. So again, if anyone has any questions about these, please feel free to email me or ask me in class. So we're going to pretend now that we've completed our work, we've chosen a journal, we've written it to the journal's specifications. What's next, right? So what is the actual what is the peer component of peer evaluation, right? So typically after you've written your paper, you submit it to a journal. If it's accepted for review, the reviewers are going to do several things. They're going to read your paper and provide a short summary of your paper, right? Their goal is to summarize the work, the quality of the work, the large findings, the minor findings. Their goal is to summarize this, depending on the individual, anywhere from a few paragraphs to a couple pages. They'll evaluate things like, is the paper clearly written? Again, that grammar aspect. Is the question or hypothesis of the paper clear? Right? There's nothing worse than reading a paper that puts forward a large body of work, but it's unclear what the goal of that work was, right? So one thing they assess is how clearly a question or hypothesis has been stated. Are the methods appropriate and controls included, right? So these peers are also experts in the field. So they have expert knowledge and expert experience that will help them review whether or not the appropriate methods were used to study the things the authors were investigating, right? So an example of this is you wouldn't claim to be studying mRNA expression if you're using a technique that historically and scientifically only explores protein expression, right? So that's another component that these peers are assessing. And whether or not proper controls are included. So because these are experts in the field, typically they have a good gauge on whether or not proper controls are included, or maybe if your methods introduce an undesirable source of error or a source of bias that could be corrected for, right? And then lastly, they will comment on the conclusions of the paper, right? Do the data support the conclusions? Hopefully, no one is trying to publish a paper whose data don't support their conclusions, but that is why we have this layer of peer review by experts to review these things, critique them, and decide if the conclusions are in fact supported by the data. So the way this whole scenario typically plays out, and I say typically because there's always going to be nuances and slight differences between journals and between individuals, and frankly, just between the way groups work together. But typically after you pick your journal, an editor is chosen for you. I think in some journals you're allowed to request who that editor is, but again, it can vary. It's so diverse, I'm not going to try and make it black and white. And after an editor is chosen for you, the editor, along with the journal, helps compile reviewers, right? And again, just like we just went over, the reviewers review your paper and they give you feedback, right? And so loosely this can come out three ways, right? So one way it can come out, reviewer one, let's say they read it and their feedback is, overall, I love it. Publish it immediately, no concerns. Or sometimes reviewer two can say something like, I have a few minor concerns, but overall the paper's pretty good. And this reviewer will make, expert suggestions on how to improve or correct for these minor concerns. And then a joke in the scientific research field is that sometimes if there is no consensus between reviewer 1 and 2, a third reviewer can be added. And this doesn't always have to be reviewer 3, but it's a running joke again in the scientific publishing community. Other feedback, the other type of feedback you can receive is that simply a reviewer does not like the paper. They don't propose anything constructive, mostly just negative feedback, right? Which ultimately doesn't help anyone improve their papers. And you'd be surprised, I shouldn't say at how often it happens, but you would probably be surprised that it happens at all, right? The idea of the peer review process is to continually improve and move the field forward, right? Not put down our peers and not give our peers constructive feedback that will ultimately help them. So, do you have any idea on how this feedback is given to the submitting authors? So after all the reviewers have reviewed it and the editor has read the reviewers' reviews, this feedback typically comes back to the publishing authors in, again, not to make things black and white, but typically 3 different ways, right? So your paper can be outright accepted. This doesn't happen too often, but it can, right? You've submitted a paper that has no issues and it's ready to go. The journal is just ready to publish it. More often than not, however, your paper will be rejected with suggested revisions, right? And this is mostly a temporary rejection. So essentially what this boils down to is that the editor has decided your paper isn't ready to print in its current format. So those reviewers will have given you suggested revisions, and the way this looks to the publishing authors is they'll give you line by line feedback. They literally read these papers line for line and can say things like, on line 10, I found this error, correct it. They can give general feedback, right, on the organization of the paper. Maybe the way you have it written or organized doesn't help your audience read it, or it doesn't make it flow very well. They can ask you to expand on topics in your writing. They can also ask you to reduce the comprehensive discussion or writing you have on certain topics. They can include references and new topics to add to your paper. Oh, here we go. Yep, can shrink certain portions. And so there's a little bit of artistic, if you want to call it artistic, play here, right? These are technically only suggestions. They aren't mandatory. And that's where one of the potentially more challenging parts of publishing comes into play, right? The incorporating feedback from reviewers versus sticking with your original plan. And I think this is probably the best place to emphasize that. Sometimes reviewers will recommend, and I think this is a typo, recommend the inclusion of additional experiments, right? And this can be a quite contentious discussion between authors and reviewers, but just know that it's one thing that reviewers can do. They can also provide grammatical feedback, and they can provide feedback on the critical interpretations of your findings, right? So maybe they think your explanation or your conclusions drawn from your data aren't quite accurate, and they'll help give you feedback on that. And then the other one is outright rejection, right? So potentially, if you've submitted a manuscript that just isn't up to snuff by any means, you can be outright rejected with no suggested revisions. So I've loosely commented on this, but why do we even do peer review, right? What's the ultimate purpose? So in the long term and grand scheme of things, peer review helps improve the body of scientific knowledge out there and available to people, right? So it's one of the self-correcting aspects of science, right? So if you submit a paper with in which you've drawn a potentially incorrect conclusion or maybe an unsubstantiated conclusion, it's one way to help correct for that, right? That panel of expert peers of yours will catch that and provide feedback on that. And also with the self-correcting aspects of science, if, at a given time, say, let's use time as a literal example, right? Maybe a paper was published 40 years ago using methods that would be considered dated today, right? Someone may choose to go back and reattempt to do that project, but use, maybe more precise or more accurate or more sophisticated tools, and find that the way in which the data collected 40 years ago wasn't accurate, right? So someone going back and repeating that experiment with better tools may come to a different conclusion, right? So that's an example of the self-correcting aspects of science. I've touched on this, right? So it's a way or a method to get feedback from other experts in the field, good or bad. And it is also one way because there's many different ways for experts to share their knowledge with the public, but it's one way for research teams or researchers to share knowledge and expert opinions with non-experts, right? So this ultimately, this is what it all boils down to, is that a lot of the work that goes on in many research labs is funded through taxpayer dollars, and it's fair to it's fair to require those researchers to share the new knowledge they've discovered with the public and the people that have funded that research. Okay, so let's switch gears here for a second now, right? So now we're going to pretend that we are no longer publishing a paper. We are trying to find papers, right? We want to start reading some research papers to learn some more things or learn some things so we can propose our own experiments. So I guess you can consider this black and white, but typically out there are two different types of publications, research publications, right? There's primary research articles and then review research articles. And going about finding them and the contents within them can be drastically different, right? So in a primary research article, primary manuscripts often share brand new knowledge for the first time with the public or other experts. And the formatting of these research articles is perhaps one you become accustomed to reading and seeing. These articles are typically formulated in an abstract. They'll have an abstract, which is a short summation of the paper, an introduction, where the authors discuss, what the problem is, what they're investigating, maybe what tools and why they've chosen to use them. They'll have a detailed methods section where they tell us exactly what tools they used. They'll report specific reagents. They'll report specific treatment paradigms. This is where really the nuts and bolts of information of how things get done is reported. They'll have a detailed results section where they report the specifics of their findings. And then the last section, last section in most of these papers, is a discussion section where the authors quite literally discuss their findings, right? They compare and contrast their findings to other publications. They compare and contrast their findings to maybe even previous findings from their own lab. And they also can, make educated guesses or proposals that go a little beyond the data, right? And this can depend on the journal and the reviewers that review the article, but sometimes some authors or teams of authors will include a little bit of speculation in the discussion that can allude to or propose future directions. So that would be primary research articles. So how about review research articles, right? So reviews quite literally review the state of the field of research, right? So these are papers that basically summate the current standing or current information out there available to everyone. They can also perform critical assessments of specific topics, right? So the topic or the focus of these reviews can vary greatly, right? So you can have a review article that references and studies or reports the efficacy of specific drugs, right? So specific classes of drugs, specific drugs used to treat specific diseases, any drug used to treat a specific disease. These review articles can cover that. The development and status, I guess if you want to call it, of class of drugs, standard of care treatment options, right? So this would be across disease, all treatment options available. And then some other, one other type is perhaps called something, what we know. Again, this would be a critical review of everything we know about a certain thing, right? And in the case of our class, you are probably going to start by searching for review articles that encompass or ask this question, what do we know about our specific environmental toxin, whichever toxin you choose to use. But ultimately, these review articles don't share any new information or data collected from experiments in a lab. Again, they aren't publishing new, previously unshared data. Their goal is to compile and summate, if you will, the status of our current understanding of something, right? And so typically these articles will be laid out, they Some have abstracts. Some of these articles even have specific materials and methods, right? Some review articles will tell you how they chose the articles they read and reviewed and included information from in their publication, but not all do. At the very least, all reviews do have a very, very lengthy works cited section, though. And for the most part, these review articles are broken up and written as a discussion, right? They're basically discussing findings from other papers. So depending on the review article, this can be broken up in different ways, right? Either by specific drug, maybe, maybe an entire page of a review will be dedicated to a specific drug, or maybe they will lay this out in kind of a chronological development of the treatment of a specific disease, right? And they'll have one paragraph dedicated to talking about treatments 40 years ago, another paragraph dedicated to treatments from 30 years ago, etc. There's a large number of ways to go about doing this. So that's a little bit about the different contents of review and research articles and how they're written. How about we talk about how we start finding these research articles or review articles, right? So one method that you can use is through keywords, right? So I mentioned this previously. All publications typically have to include several keywords that will help people pin down and locate their article. So you're actually going to go through the process of finding these articles when you perform our primary versus review workshop today in class, or when you enter class, right? So here's a link to an article that you could locate by using these keywords, and you guessed it. This article evaluates a drug that acts on the cannabinoid 2 receptor and how it changes cytokine and chemokine expression. And ultimately, the authors are investigating how that drug affects cancer-induced bone pain, right? So you can see that in the choice of keywords here. Another method, perhaps you're interested in checking up on how a specific researcher is doing. You can locate articles simply by typing in the names of authors. So here's an example of a paper that I'm on. The senior author over here, Tamara King, has worked for several years, is an understatement. She's worked extensively with Frank Paretka. So they're the two senior authors on this paper. And then here's me. I was the first author, Ian Imbert, Jennifer Cormier, and Josh Allen, right? For instance, if we knew these 6 people had published an article, but we didn't know the name or the contents, we just knew that they had published one, you could type in all these author names on PubMed, and up would pop that specific paper. And then the last example, typically you already have your answer here. You can use specific searching, right? So this is a specific paper from the journal named Pain, not to be confused with the Journal of Pain, but the name of this journal is Pain. We know it was published in October 2015. It's in volume 156, issue 10, on pages 1864 to 1873, right? We could technically go in and plug in that specific information and locate that specific paper. Again, usually you know what this article is, or you know what's in this article. In this instance, you're typically just trying to locate a PDF for it so you can download it and share it with people. So I mentioned this previously, and our activity in lab is going to have you use PubMed as a resource, but sometimes PubMed will bring you to a paper that's behind a paywall, right? And I also mentioned this earlier, that many institutions' library websites have a portal and a process to locate and gain access to research articles or review articles that might be behind a paywall, excuse me. So how you would do that here at UNE, right? So let's pretend we've used PubMed, we've located an article, we tried to download the PDF, and it says that you need a subscription to that journal to access it. The first thing you should try is go to library.une.edu, plug in or log in your information, and then you will find this search bar here, right? So in the search bar, you can type in whatever keywords you want. If you have the title of the journal article, again, if you pretend that you located it on PubMed but you can't get it, you can literally just copy and paste the title of the article into the search bar. Click search. Up will come your article, right? So the title of this article is Mechanisms Underlying Bone and Joint Pain. So this pops up here. You can click on right here, right? So it says get it now. This means, or should mean, that your library or your institution has an active subscription to this research journal. And so this is one of the things that your tuition dollars goes towards paying for. The Unity Library has a subscription to a large number of research journals, and you get free access to those, again, because your tuition dollars help pay for that. And then, so when you click Get It Now, you will come over to probably the electronic server that maintains where the PDF is, or you might get brought over directly to the journal's website, the research journal's website, and you'll have your article, right? Then you can just click on Download PDF, wherever it may be on the web page, download it, and you have it. And specific to the project in Chem 310, you will be required to download, save, and compile all PDFs that you cite in your research article, right? So you're going to download them, compile them, and upload them at the end of the semester so that I can review them and make sure that the research or information you guys are pulling from is from research articles and not obscure blogs on the internet. So that's how to find articles and download them. Once you start downloading articles and reading them, as I mentioned, you may need 12 or 24 or 36 research articles to cite for your paper this semester. Try and develop a scheme in saving and storing these papers. So the way I developed, or a method I developed in grad school when saving many, many articles, was using this. So I retitle all papers I download and save them as the first author last name, last author last name, the year it was published, and then either the title of the article or some information from that article. And I use this because once you start focusing your research, you're likely going to be reading articles from the same individuals over and over and over, right? And one example of this is right here. So this first article, Chang Heinricher, was published in 2019, and it's about the parabrachial nucleus complex, and it's a review article. Right below here is an article from Chang Ross, published in 2019, which contains information about the divergent neural pathways from the lateral PBN and how they mediate components of pain, right? So this might be the same individual. This may be the same first author. It might not be. If it's not, then that's why I include the last author's name. So typically the last author on a paper is the senior author. It's usually whoever contributed the most to the development and resources to complete the project. And then again, the year to help differentiate when these articles were published. Let's see if I have another example here. So here's another one. Well, this is the same paper, Edelmeyer. So that should be good enough. I think that highlights the utility of my method. You can use whatever method you like. Again, this is just one I used. In my grad school days, I read over 200, 300 articles, and this helped me keep everything organized. So where to begin? Once you guys have completed today's activity, or again, whichever week you're doing this in, you can begin by practicing and searching for an article you are interested in or relevant to the selections you've made in our class. After we've picked the environmental toxin you'll be exposing your zebrafish larvae to, right? And the first place you will be held responsible for that is when you guys type up your experimental planning document. Instructions for this can be found in the course overview tab or module on our course Brightspace page. But essentially, you guys are going to you're going to begin your research, and you're going to begin reporting some of your findings in this document. If you have any questions about that, again, you can email me. So one last comment on review versus research articles. When you do today's activity, again, you're going to be going through different primary research articles, different review research articles, locating them, reading them, etc. We're going to practice for this in week 2. One last tidbit about identifying differences between these two types of articles. Oftentimes nowadays, publishers will include what type of article they are at the top left, right? Remember the rules I discussed at the beginning of class, at the beginning of this discussion. But again, some publishers will outright tell you right in the top left or top right. So this is a review article and this is a research article. Keep that in mind, because one of the learning objectives of this class is to be able to distinguish the difference between a primary research article and a review article. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to email me at jhavlin@uni.edu.